The offer had been made at midnight, in a library that smelled of beeswax and old paper, and she had declined it without raising her voice. Eleanor Ashworth stood at the edge of the Marquis of Carlisle's ballroom with a clipboard of linen inventory pressed against her forearm, and 17 candles burning lower than they ought to have been by this hour. The ballroom itself was precisely what the occasion required. Garlands of hothouse roses draped from column to column in careful intervals. The chandelier blazing with 240 candles counted that morning by Eleanor's own hand. The floor polished until it gave back the image of every silk skirt and military coat that swept across it. Lady Carlisle's winter assembly was the first of the season, and the room understood its responsibility. The guests arranged themselves in their correct formations, the young women in ivory and pale blue, the gentlemen in dark tailcoats and white waistcoats, the matrons anchored in their chairs along the eastern wall like a row of judgments. The musicians had been placed at the northern end, and Eleanor had stood over the placement for 10 minutes that afternoon, until the violinist's stand no longer reflected in the punch bowl. No one had noticed this. No one had been meant to. And at the edge of all that deliberate splendor, holding the inventory she would check 3 more times before the night was over, was Eleanor Ashworth. She was 27, unmarried, and employed, if that word could be applied to an arrangement in which no wages had exchanged hands in 14 months, as household secretary to her mother's cousin, Lady Carlisle. She wore a dress of gray wool that was suitable and unremarkable, which was the most she had asked of it. Her hair was pinned with the same 3 pins she used on Tuesdays and Saturdays. She had a pin tucked behind her ear that she moved to her hand when she wrote, and back behind her ear when she walked, and she had been doing this long enough that she no longer noticed it. The Duke of Ashmore entered the ballroom at 9:30, which was 12 minutes after the time she had noted in the evening schedule, and Eleanor made a small pencil mark in the margin of her clipboard to record it. He came in the way men of his position generally entered rooms, without appearing to enter at all, without the performance of arrival. He was tall and dark-coated, dressed with the particular restraint that communicated wealth more effectively than ornamentation ever could. His cravat was white and tied with precision. He did not smile at anyone specifically. He accepted 2 greetings from gentlemen he appeared to know, and turned one away from a group who had angled toward him too obviously, and then he stood at the edge of the room and looked at it, and Eleanor watched him look. He did not look at what everyone else looked at. He did not look at the roses or the chandelier or Lady Carlisle's eldest daughter, who was wearing pearl drops and a smile calibrated for exactly this kind of evening. He looked at the architecture of the thing, the way the guests had arranged themselves, the geography of ambition in the room. He looked the way someone looks when they are reading a document rather than admiring a painting. Then he looked at Eleanor, not with interest, not with recognition, with the specific attention of a man who has noticed something he cannot yet classify and intends to classify it. Eleanor looked down at her clipboard and made another pencil mark that she would not remember the purpose of by morning. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like notice. Eleanor Ashworth had come to Carlisle House 3 years and 2 months earlier, in November of 1813, with a leather satchel containing her father's final accounts and a letter of introduction that her mother had spent a week composing and then wept over. Her father, a solicitor of modest practice in York, a man of precise habits and genuine warmth, had died in September of that year, leaving behind a house with a creditor's lien against it, a practice that dissolved within the week, and a daughter who understood double-entry bookkeeping better than anyone he had ever trained formally, because he had taught her informally, in the evenings, at the dining-room table, when there was nothing else to teach her. Her mother's cousin was Lady Carlisle, married 40 years to a marquis who had died 6 years before, and left an estate in reasonable order. Lady Carlisle was not unkind. She was simply a woman of her era, which meant that she understood the situation clearly. a relative in reduced circumstances, equipped with skills that would be useful to the household, and arranged accordingly. Eleanor was given a room at the north end of the house, 3 dresses the first year, and responsibilities that expanded in direct proportion to her willingness to manage them without complaint. She had become responsible for the household accounts within her first month, when she found an error of £43 in the quarterly ledger that the previous secretary had been carrying forward for 3 years without correction. She had presented it to Lady Carlisle without drama, in a simple half-page written summary, and Lady Carlisle had said, "Very good, Eleanor. See that it is corrected." And that had been the end of it, not the end of Eleanor's work, which began in earnest from that morning, but the end of any acknowledgement. She had learned, in the 14 months since wages had ceased, the arrangement recast as room and board in lieu, when Lady Carlisle's wool investments underperformed, to think of acknowledgement the way she thought of certain luxuries she had encountered in houses she managed, pleasant for those who could afford them, irrelevant to the work itself. What she had managed in 3 years was this. She had reduced the household's quarterly supply costs by negotiating directly with the London merchant houses rather than accepting the prices the house steward had always accepted. She had renegotiated the tenancy agreements on the 2 farms attached to the Carlisle town property when the leases expired, adding clauses her predecessor had omitted, recovering an annual income of £280 that had simply not existed before. She had identified, in the course of one rainy October afternoon, that the ground floor heating system was being managed by 2 separate footmen who each believed the other responsible for a particular flue, which is why 3 rooms had been cold for 2 winters running. She had fixed this with a handwritten schedule and a 10-minute conversation. None of these things appeared in any document with her name on them. They appeared as improvements in the household's quarterly accounts, attributed to the general efficiency of Carlisle House. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. She had been seen clearly, once, by someone who mattered. Her father, on a Tuesday evening in June, looking up from his ledger at her annotations in the margin, had said, "Eleanor, you have a mind that does not waste itself." She had been 19. He had died 8 years later, and she had not forgotten the exact quality of his attention in that moment, the particular expression of a man who is seeing something accurately and intends to say so. She had been waiting since then for that quality of attention from anyone who had the power to do something with it. She was not expecting it at Lady Carlisle's winter assembly. She was expecting to verify the candle count, ensure the supper arrangements were managed correctly, and retire at midnight with her inventory completed. She had not expected the library. She had gone there at 1:45 to retrieve the amended supper list she had left on the desk that afternoon, and she had found the Duke of Ashmore standing at the window with his coat removed and draped over the chair, holding a ledger she recognized as Carlisle House's most recent quarterly accounts. He had not been startled when she entered. He had turned and looked at her with the same classifying attention she had felt across the ballroom, and then he had said, "These accounts were done by someone who understands marginal notation. I should like to know if that person is available for a different position." It had not been a compliment. It had been an assessment delivered in the manner of a man who expected to be understood accurately. Eleanor had stood in the doorway with the amended supper list in her hand and said, "I am the person who annotated those accounts, Your Grace." He had looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone checking a calculation. Then he had said, "I am in need of an estate secretary at Ashmore Park, someone who can manage what I have allowed to fall into disorder. I am prepared to offer a proper wage, formal contract, and the title of the position." She had said, "I am obliged to Lady Carlisle through the spring." He had said, "I am aware of that. I am asking whether the position would interest you, in principle." and she had said without inflection, "I am not in a position to consider positions offered at midnight in someone else's library, Your Grace." He had looked at her, and something that might have been appreciation moved briefly across his face, like weather observed through glass. Then he had inclined his head, taken his coat from the chair, and walked past her, and she had retrieved the supper list and returned to the ballroom and finished her evening. She had not slept particularly well, not from agitation. She was not an agitated woman, but from the problem of him, which did not resolve itself the way ordinary problems did. She did not know then that he had been in that library deliberately. James Ashmore, 7th Duke of Ashmore, had hired an inquiry agent in October, not because he was suspicious by nature, he was thorough, which is a different quality, but because Ashmore Park had been in a state of progressive administrative collapse for 4 years, and he had been in it long enough to know that what the estate required was not another estate manager of the usual type. What it required was someone who could hold several kinds of problem in mind simultaneously and move between them without losing the thread of any. He had discharged 2 estate managers in 18 months. The first had been honest but unable to negotiate with creditors. The second had been an excellent negotiator, and had been negotiating, it turned out, partly for himself. The inquiry agent's report on Eleanor Ashworth had arrived in November, 2 weeks before the Carlisle Assembly. It was 3 pages, specific and unexpected. She had been managing Carlisle House's accounts, it stated, for 3 years. In that time, the household's annual expenditure had decreased by 14%, while its income from attached properties had increased by £280 per year. She had renegotiated 4 supply contracts, corrected errors in 3 years of prior accounts, and restructured the tenancy agreements on the northern properties without legal assistance. She had done this in a position with no official title, no wages for the past 14 months, and no acknowledgement in any household document. James had read the report twice, which was once more than he usually read anything. He understood the specific texture of invisible labor. His mother had died when he was 11, and before she died she had managed the emotional infrastructure of Ashmore Park, the relationships between tenants and house, between the Duke's temperament and the staff's morale, between the estate's ambitions and its actual capacities, with the same quiet thoroughness that had made everything function and that no one had articulated until it stopped. He had watched his father, a man of good intentions and genuine grief, spend the following 15 years struggling to manage what his mother had made look effortless. He had no patience for effortless. He had great respect for invisible work that could be shown, when shown, to have held something together. He had attended the Carlisle Assembly for one reason. He had stood at the edge of the ballroom and looked for the woman the report had described, and found her inside 4 minutes, because she was the only person in the room who was attending to the room rather than to the event. He had spent 20 minutes observing her before she had observed him. Then he had gone to the library and waited, and she had come for her supper list, and he had made his offer. And she had declined it, in the quiet, precise manner of a woman who has decided what she will and will not do, and is not going to be moved from that decision by the authority of his title. He had walked home through the December cold with his coat collar turned up and the specific sensation of a man who has had a calculation returned to him with an annotation he had not anticipated. He revised the offer in his study until 3 in the morning. He sent it to his solicitor at 6, with instructions for delivery that morning. Eleanor was in the morning room at 8:30, drinking tea and reviewing the previous night's supply receipts, when Hawkins the footman brought her a sealed letter on a salver. She looked at it and set down her tea. The seal was a ducal one. She opened it without expression. The letter was brief and formal. It offered her the position of estate secretary at Ashmore Park at an annual salary of £120, which was more than she had been paid in any position and more than she had expected from anyone. With a formal contract, her own set of offices, a private apartment in the East Wing, and a start date of her choosing after her obligation to Lady Carlisle concluded. It stated that the position was hers without condition. It stated in a closing line that was perfectly businesslike and somehow not businesslike at all, that he had read the quarterly accounts more carefully after she had gone and found 11 additional annotations he had not initially identified, and that he hoped she would consider this position as what it was intended to be, a proper post with a proper wage for demonstrably proper work. Eleanor sat with the letter for some time. Then she set it beside her tea, picked up the supply receipts, and continued reviewing them. She did not say yes that morning. She was not a woman who said yes to things before she had examined them from all sides, but she pressed one hand briefly against the surface of the desk, a gesture that meant nothing to anyone who might have observed it, and meant a great deal to her, and then she returned to her work. She wrote her acceptance 4 days later, in a hand that was clear and level, and sent it without a supplementary note. She arrived at Ashmore Park on the 15th of April, which was 3 weeks after her obligation to Lady Carlisle had formally concluded, with 2 trunks, her father's ledger annotation manual, and a calm that she had decided to maintain regardless of what she found. What she found was considerable. Ashmore Park was a house of 46 rooms set in a Wiltshire estate of approximately 3,000 acres, of which roughly a third had been actively managed in the past decade, and the remainder left to a kind of organized neglect that looked like management from a distance and wasn't. The house itself was in reasonable structural condition. The accounts were not. Eleanor spent her first 3 days simply reading. Every ledger, every contract, every tenancy document she could locate, sitting at the desk in the estate office with a lamp that the housekeeper, Mrs. Greer, replenished without being asked, because Mrs. Greer was a woman who recognized work when she saw it, and had been waiting 2 years for someone who would do it. The last secretary, Mrs. Greer told her on the second morning, setting a pot of tea on the corner of the desk with the decisiveness of someone establishing a position, left 3 months ago. Before him there was Mr. Calder, who was efficient but not honest, if you take my meaning. His Grace has been managing what he can himself, which is more than most dukes would trouble with, but managing accounts is not the same as understanding them. Eleanor had looked up from the wool merchant's contract. How long have the Northern tenant farms been paying at the old rate? Mrs. Greer blinked. I couldn't say exactly, miss. Since 1808, Eleanor said, and turned the page. She had found, by the end of her first week, the following: 14 tenancy agreements that had not been updated since the estate's last formal review in 1808. A wool merchant contract that included a weight-based pricing clause that had not been applied correctly in 3 seasons, representing a loss of approximately £460 to the estate. A drainage improvement that had been authorized and paid for in 1811, but apparently never completed, with the funds unaccounted for, and a supply arrangement with a London grocer that included a standing order for quantities the house had not required since the Duke's father entertained at his former scale. She organized these findings into a single document, methodical, numbered, annotated with the specific ledger page for every figure she cited, and left it on the Duke's desk one morning before he was down. He had not spoken to her directly since her arrival. He was present in the house. She was aware of him the way one is aware of weather, a quality of the atmosphere rather than a specific disturbance. He appeared at breakfast occasionally and departed for the estate early. He had acknowledged her arrival with a formal welcome in the entrance hall, expressed his satisfaction at her presence with the efficiency of a man who had said what was required and meant it, and then stepped out of her way and allowed her to work. She found the following morning that her document had been returned to her desk. In the margin of the drainage finding, in a hand that was precise without being ornate, he had written, I have the contractor's name, I believe he is still operating in Wiltshire. Do you recommend legal recovery or renegotiation? Eleanor read this twice. Then she picked up her pen and wrote in her own margin beneath his. Renegotiation with documented evidence of non-completion. Legal recovery would cost more than the improvement is worth. I recommend a meeting with the contractor and a written acknowledgement of debt, redeemable in labor on the southern drainage, which also needs attention. She left the document on his desk. He found her the following afternoon in the estate office, where she was working through the tenancy agreements with the efficiency of a woman who has given herself a deadline. He did not knock, but he paused in the doorway long enough that she looked up before he spoke, which she understood was his version of it. The contractor agreed to a meeting, he said. Thursday. I should attend, Eleanor said. I have the documentation organized. He considered this for a moment in the particular way he considered things, which was with complete stillness. Yes, he said. I thought you might. He looked at the stack of tenancy documents on the corner of her desk. You have been at those for 3 days. They are 14 agreements, she said, and each one needs individual amendment. I expect to have a revised set for your review by the end of the week. He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that was not quite surprise, that landed somewhere between recalibration and attention. Very well, he said. He did not leave immediately. He stood in the doorway for a moment longer than was necessary, looking not at her but at the organized surface of the desk, the stacked documents, the lamp she had angled to cover the full width of the ledger. Then he said, There is a collection of my father's music in the morning room. My mother's, in fact. She was the musician. It has not been touched in some time. If you have occasion to use the morning room in the evenings, you are welcome to it. Eleanor looked at him. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the middle distance to the left of her desk in the manner of a man who has said something he did not intend to examine closely. Thank you, Your Grace, she said. He inclined his head and left. She had been at the piano twice in the evenings before she came to Ashmore Park, once at Lady Carlisle's, and once, memorably, at a neighbor's house in York, before her father died. She was not a performer. She played carefully, with the attention she gave to everything, and she understood music the way she understood accounts, as a structure in which every component had a function, and nothing was wasted. She went to the morning room on Friday evening after her desk was clear, found the music in a cabinet that had been locked and the key left in the lock, which was the particular quality of something preserved rather than abandoned, and opened it. It was a collection of handwritten scores. A woman's hand, she could see at once, clear and precise. She sat at the piano and played one, slowly, working through the unfamiliar notation with the patience she brought to unfamiliar ledgers, and she heard, from somewhere in the corridor, the sound of a door opened and not closed. She did not stop playing. She did not turn. She played for 40 minutes. When she finished and gathered the scores and replaced them with care in the cabinet, she found that the corridor was empty but that there was a lamp burning on the hall table that had not been lit when she came in. She had managed creditor negotiations across the kitchen table with Lady Carlisle's wool merchant. She had kept a house operational through the winter with no wages and no acknowledgement. She could manage this. What was developing between her and the Duke of Ashmore was not discussed by either of them, which was how she knew it was real. She had observed enough of social convention to know that things discussed early were managed early, which is a way of keeping them at arm's length. What was real did not need to be managed. It needed to be sat with, like a calculation you could not hurry. He came to the contractor meeting on Thursday and did not speak unnecessarily. She presented the documentation, the original work order, the payment record, the inspection report she had located in a box of 1811 correspondence, and she laid it before the contractor in the simple way she laid everything before anyone, without dramatics, without argument, only with the evidence arranged in the order that made its meaning unavoidable. The contractor looked at it for some time and then agreed, in writing, to the terms she had drafted. The Duke signed the document last and handed the pen back to her without a word, which she understood as a different kind of word. She revised 14 tenancy agreements in 11 days, adding clauses that secured the estate's income against the depreciation errors that had accumulated over the previous decade. She renegotiated the wool merchant's pricing clause and recovered, in the first corrected season, £390. She cancelled the standing grocer's order and replaced it with a quarterly arrangement that would save the house approximately £60 per year. He did not compliment her on these things. He read each document with complete attention and then signed where she indicated and made the occasional marginal note. And once, on the revised wool contract, he noted in the margin that she had used a clause structure he had not encountered and asked where she had learned it. She had written back, "My father. He was a solicitor in York. He believed that a contract without a performance clause was a promise without a consequence." There had been a pause of 2 days before he responded. Then a note appeared on her desk that said only, "He was correct." She had pressed her hand against the desk again. Then she had continued. The opposition, when it organized itself formally, came from 2 directions. Lady Sylvia Pemberton arrived at Ashmore Park on the 3rd Saturday of May, in a carriage that was newer than it needed to be for a country journey, with her mother the Countess, a personal maid, and the comfortable certainty of a woman who has been told for many years that she is exactly the right answer to an important question. She was 24, handsome, precisely accomplished in the ways that mattered: French, watercolor, the pianoforte at a level that indicated proper instruction, and she had been acquainted with the Duke of Ashmore's social obligations since she was 17. Eleanor learned of the visit from Mrs. Greer, who delivered the information along with the morning tea tray on Thursday, with the specific directness of a woman sharing intelligence that is relevant to someone's planning. "Lady Sylvia has visited twice before," Mrs. Greer said, "once with the late Duke's recommendation and once at her mother's initiative. His Grace receives them with perfect politeness." She paused. "He receives most things with perfect politeness." "I see," Eleanor said, and added the visit to the household schedule. Lady Sylvia was polite to Eleanor in the manner of someone being polite to furniture that has been placed in an inconvenient location. She looked at Eleanor's position at the table during the formal dinner, below the Countess, above the senior footman, in the particular purgatory of the indeterminate guest, and offered her a smile that was perfectly calibrated. She spoke to the Duke with the fluency of long preparation, and listened to him with the performance of genuine interest, and the Duke listened to her in return with the particular quality of attention that indicated he was entirely present and entirely elsewhere. Lady Sylvia played the pianoforte after dinner. She was genuinely accomplished. Eleanor would not have said otherwise, and she chose a Haydn sonata that she had clearly practiced until it was polished smooth. The Duke sat with the neutrality of a man fulfilling an obligation. Eleanor sat near the window with a cup of tea and her mind on the drainage survey she had scheduled for the following morning. Afterward, in the corridor, Lady Sylvia found Eleanor returning a pair of scissors to the sewing room and said pleasantly, "I understand you have been reorganizing the estate accounts. It must be such useful work." Eleanor said, "It is." Lady Sylvia looked at her with the specific expression of a woman who has fired a round and found that the target hasn't moved. "His Grace mentioned that you have managed the tenancy agreements. 14 of them, I believe. 16 as it stands," Eleanor said. "I revised the Northern Farms this week." There was a brief pause. "Quite," Lady Sylvia said. "Good evening, Miss Ashworth." She turned and walked down the corridor, and Eleanor watched her go with the calm of a woman who has been diminished by professionals and knows the feeling precisely. She returned to her office and added 2 items to her morning list. The other direction from which opposition came was the Duke's solicitor, A man named Mr. Trevithick, who arrived from London at the end of May with a portfolio of concerns that were entirely legitimate and delivered in a tone that was barely so. He was 60, precise in the way of men who have spent long careers being right about things. And he looked at Eleanor's revised accounts with the expression of a man who has found a new piece of furniture in a room he considered organized. "The tenancy revisions are effective," he told the Duke, in Eleanor's presence, in the manner of a man speaking about a document while looking at the person who wrote it. "I would have advised a simpler clause structure for the performance agreements. The one Miss Ashworth has used is unusual." "It is precise," the Duke said. "It is not customary." "Customary agreements," Eleanor said, because the moment required it and because she had the relevant information, are what produced the original errors. The standard clause in use here before 1808 made no provision for depreciation adjustment. Over 12 years, that omission cost the estate approximately £900 in unrecovered shortfall. The clause I have used closes that gap. Mr. Trevithick looked at her. She looked at him with the expression she had developed for creditor negotiations. Not aggressive, simply present. She had the figures in the document in front of her if he wished to review them. She did not offer this. She waited. He turned to the Duke. "The figure is accurate?" he said. "I have verified it," the Duke said. Mr. Trevithick looked at Eleanor once more, and then returned his attention to the portfolio. "I would recommend filing the revised agreements by the end of June," he said. He did not acknowledge the clause again, but he did not recommend changing it. Eleanor picked up her pen and made a note on her draft calendar. On the last day of May, the Duke came to find her in the garden where she was walking the drainage survey route for the third time, with a hand-drawn map and a pair of muddy boots she had not bothered to change before coming out. He came across the south lawn with his coat on and his hat off, which was backwards from how one usually walked into weather, and he fell into step beside her without asking whether she wanted company, which she found she did not mind. "Trevithick has approved the filing schedule," he said. "I received his note," she said. "I will have the documents ready by the 21st. They walked a little way in the particular quiet of the garden, which was different from the silence of the house. It had birds in it, and the smell of turned earth from the kitchen beds. "You have managed all of this," he said, "in 7 weeks. She considered the map in her hand. "There is more to do," she said. "The drainage survey, the Northern Wood lease. I have not yet addressed the London property accounts, which I understand are held separately." "They are," he said. "I intended to ask whether you would take those on as well." He paused. "I recognize that it was not in the original agreement." "If you wish," Eleanor said, "I can draft an amendment." He looked at her then, and she looked at him, and the late May light came across the south lawn the way light does when a season is settling into itself, unhurried. He had a quality, when he looked at her directly, of complete attention that she had not encountered in many people. It was the same quality her father had had, and it cost him something. She could see that, and it was not a cost he resented. "You are not what I expected," he said, which was not a compliment in the ordinary sense, and was true in a way ordinary compliments were not. "You did not tell me what to expect," she said, "so I brought what I had." She looked back at the map. "The drainage here will need 2 weeks of work in July. I want to be present when the laborers begin, so that I can ensure it follows the correct line." He said nothing. He simply fell into step beside her again, and they walked the drainage route to the end, and he held the corner of the map so the wind did not take it while she marked the correction point, and neither of them said anything about it afterward. She went back to the house and straightened her spine and continued with her afternoon, and she did not examine the exact weight of what she was carrying with more precision than it required. The crisis arrived in June, packaged as a formal letter from the Ashmore Park Investor Council, which was a body of 4 men who held financial interests in the estate's wool and timber operations, and who had been informed, by some route that Eleanor tracked back to Mr. Trevithick's junior clerk, that the Duke was considering an unorthodox administrative arrangement. The letter was formally courteous and substantively a warning. It expressed concern about significant contractual revisions made without consultation. It questioned the authority under which an estate secretary of irregular appointment had been empowered to renegotiate standing agreements. It noted, in a closing paragraph that was doing quite a lot of work, that the investors were available to meet with His Grace at his earliest convenience to discuss the management structure of the estate. Eleanor read the letter. She read it because it had been given to her by the Duke, who had brought it to her office with the expression of a man delivering news he expects to be assessed rather than received, and she set it down and looked at it for a moment. She said, "They have 4 specific objections: the tenancy revisions, the wool contract amendment, the grocer cancellation, and the appointment itself." "Yes," he said. "The first 3 are defensible by the numbers. I have documented everything." She looked up at him. "The 4th is the real question." He looked at her steadily. "They do not have the authority to dictate my appointments." "No," she said, "but they have the authority to make you regret them publicly, which is a different kind of authority." She paused. "I would recommend a formal meeting. I will prepare the financial recovery figures in full. Let them see exactly what the revisions have produced." "They may still oppose you," he said. "Then they will oppose me with the numbers in front of them," she said, "which is a different position than opposing me without them." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You are not alarmed?" She considered this. "No," she said. "I have managed creditors. This is a variation." She picked up her pen. "When would you like to hold the meeting?" The council meeting was scheduled for the 22nd of June in the estate's formal reception room, which Eleanor had arranged with the particular care she brought to arrangements that mattered: a long table, chairs of equal quality for all parties, the relevant documents organized in 4 sets and placed at each chair with deliberation. She had spent 5 days preparing the presentation, not from anxiety but from the understanding that this was the instrument she had available and she intended it to be precise. The 4 investors arrived. Sir Howard Greaves, who held the largest single interest and who looked at Eleanor when he entered the room with an expression she recognized as the institutional variety of skepticism, not personal but structural, the look of a system confronting an anomaly. Mr. Barnstable, who was younger and primarily concerned with the wool contract. Mr. Ashe, who was the timber interest and who looked at everything with the caution of a man who had been wrong before and remembered it. And Lord Creighton, the eldest, who was the Duke's father's oldest surviving associate, and who sat down at the table and looked at Eleanor for a long time before he looked at anything else. The Duke sat at the head of the table. Eleanor sat at his right hand, which was where he had placed her chair, and she noticed that he had placed it there and did not remark on it. "Gentlemen," she said when they had settled, "I will present the estate's financial position for the 12 months preceding my appointment and the 7 weeks since. I would ask that you hold questions until I have completed the summary. It will be easier to see the full picture before addressing any part of it." Sir Howard looked at the Duke. The Duke looked at Sir Howard with the complete stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the room to catch up to it. She presented for 35 minutes. She did not argue. She did not appeal to authority or social fitness or any quality of her own character. She presented numbers in their sequence, what the estate had been losing, where, for how long, and what each of her revisions had produced in recoverable terms. The tenancy revisions projected an additional £340 per year. The wool contract correction had already returned £390 in the current season. The contractor settlement had secured £2,000 in drainage improvements without expenditure. The grocer cancellation would save £60 annually from the following quarter. She set the annotated version of each agreement in front of each investor. She did not tell them what to think of it. She gave them the documents and waited. There was a silence when she finished. It was not the silence of a room that has been defeated. It was the silence of a room that is recalibrating. Mr. Barnstable was the first to speak. "The wool pricing clause," he said, and his tone had shifted from the one he had arrived with. "You found the discrepancy in the weight-based rate?" "I did," Eleanor said. "It has been in the contract for 6 years," he said. 7, she said. "It was introduced in 1816, in the amended agreement. The original 1813 contract had the correct formula." She turned to the relevant page in his document set and placed her finger below the line. "The error is here." He looked at it. He looked at it for quite a long time. Lord Creighton said, without looking up from the accounts, "My objection was not to the numbers." He turned a page. It was to the irregularity of the appointment. "I understand," Eleanor said. "A woman in this position is not customary." "No," she said. "It creates structural complications that the estate does not benefit from managing." She looked at him steadily. "Lord Creighton, the estate's accounts for the past 4 years show a consistent pattern of loss in exactly the areas I have addressed. The structural complication the estate has been managing is a different one." She let this sit without elaboration. The numbers were in front of him. They were the elaboration. Lord Creighton looked at her for the first time with something that was not skepticism exactly, but something less certain than it had been. Sir Howard turned to the Duke. "Your Grace, the figures are clear enough. The appointment is unusual. I would ask what you intend going forward." The Duke set down his copy of the accounts. He looked at Sir Howard with the particular quality of attention that Eleanor had come to understand was his version of emphasis. "I intend to keep Miss Ashworth in the position she holds," he said, "and to formalize her contract at the terms we agreed in April. I further intend to extend her authority to the London property accounts, which I expect will produce comparable results." He paused. "If the Council has concerns about the numbers, I am prepared to discuss them. If the concern is about Miss Ashworth's position, that is not a Council matter." Sir Howard looked at Eleanor. He looked at her the way people look at things they have not had occasion to look at directly before. "The figures stand," he said at last. "We will want the next quarterly report at the Council's regular September meeting." "Of course," Eleanor said. "I will have it ready by the 1st. The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment, and then the investors closed their document sets in the particular way of men accepting a position they had not chosen and intending to remember that they had accepted it under duress, which was fine. That was as much as she had needed. Lord Creighton was the last to leave. He paused at the door, and Eleanor was sorting the remaining document sets at the table, and he turned back and looked at her for a moment, with an expression that was not warmth and was not contempt, but was something that moved between them like a cleared debt. "Your father's name?" he said. "Ashworth. Was he the solicitor in York?" Eleanor looked up. "He was." Lord Creighton considered this. "I knew his work," he said. "He had a precision that was not common." He paused. "I see it has not been lost." He turned and left. Eleanor stood in the emptied room with the sorted documents in her hands, and she pressed them carefully against her chest, and she breathed out once, slowly, and then she went back to work. She did not see the Duke until that evening. She was in the estate office when he came to the doorway, and she looked up and he looked at her, and there was between them the particular quality of a completed thing that neither of them had known was building until it was done. "You were extraordinary," he said. She considered this. "I was prepared," she said. "Yes," he said, "it is the same thing." He came into the office then, which he did not usually do, and he stood at the window that looked out over the south lawn in the diminishing evening light, and she sat at her desk with her hands resting on the documents, and they stayed like this in a companionable quiet for some minutes. he said without turning. "My mother played the last piece you played on Friday." She did not say anything immediately. "I stood in the corridor for 3 nights," he said. "I expect you knew." "The lamp," she said. "Yes." He turned then. He looked at her with the unguarded quality she had seen in him precisely twice before. Once in the library at Carlisle House, once on the South Lawn in May, and it was still the expression she could not classify comfortably, which was exactly why she trusted it. "Eleanor," he said. It was the first time he had used her name without her title, and he used it the way her father had said precise, as though it meant what it said. "I should like to speak to you about something that is not the estate accounts." She waited. He moved from the window and came to stand at the desk. He did not reach for her hand. He stood at the distance of a man who has learned to move carefully in rooms where things matter. "I made you an offer at midnight in a library," he said, "and you declined it correctly. And I made you a different one at dawn, and you accepted it, and I believe it was the right offer and the right acceptance. What I have not done is say plainly what I should have said in the spring." "You did not need to say it," Eleanor said. "You came across a garden in the wrong weather and held the corner of my map." Something moved in his face that she had not seen before, something lighter than his usual expression, like a door opened to a room that had been closed for some time. "Nonetheless," he said. He reached into his coat pocket and set a small box on the desk with the deliberateness of a man who has rehearsed this and decided to go ahead regardless. "I am asking you," he said, "not because it is convenient or appropriate or fitted the requirements my position imposes, but because you have a mind that does not waste itself, and you have a quality of attention that I have looked for in 20 years in rooms full of people, and because you played my mother's music as though it deserved to be heard, which it did, and because I have been a better version of myself since the 15th of April than I have been in some years, and I am aware of exactly why that is." Eleanor looked at the box. She looked at him. She did not answer immediately, because she was not a woman who answered immediately, and he appeared to understand this, because he waited with the stillness of a man who has planted something and trusts the ground. She thought about her father's ledger, annotated in margins no one read. She thought about Lady Carlisle's winter assembly and the 16 candles that needed tending. She thought about the morning room and the cabinet with the key left in the lock, and the lamp lit in the corridor, and the corner of the map held against the wind. She said yes. He opened the box himself and took out a ring, plain, precise gold with a single stone of dark blue, and he did not hand it to her. He came around the desk, and she stood, and he took her hand, and he kissed it, bare, which was almost the first time he had touched her without the mediating layer of document or formality, and it was exactly as weighted as all the other moments had been. They were married in September, in the parish church at Ashmore, with Mrs. Greer in the front pew in a hat she had purchased specifically, and Charlotte Redmayne, who had become Eleanor's closest friend in the county, a solicitor's wife with 4 children, and a frank manner that Eleanor had trusted from their first conversation, weeping with the unapologetic pleasure of a woman who feels things completely. Mr. Haverstock, the retired estate advisor who had been the first to tell the Duke, in November, that Eleanor's management of the Carlisle accounts was a matter of record and deserved recognition, attended and did not weep, and was moved in ways he did not articulate, but that were visible to anyone paying attention. Lord Creighton attended and shook Eleanor's hand after the ceremony with the grip of a man paying a long-standing debt, and said only, "Your father would have thought this well managed," and Eleanor said, "Yes, I believe he would." The Investor Council's September report was the first quarterly account to show the estate's full income reconciled without discrepancy. Mr. Barnstable wrote a note congratulating the Duke on his excellent administrative arrangements. Eleanor read this and found it accurate enough to be worth keeping. Lady Sylvia Pemberton was engaged to a viscount by Christmas, and wrote Eleanor a formally correct wedding congratulation that was perfect in every respect, and Eleanor replied with equal formality and harbored no ill will, because Lady Sylvia had been the system made visible, not the system itself, and the system had shifted. Their daughter was born in July of the following year, a girl they named Frances, who had her father's stillness and her mother's precision from the very beginning, who appeared to assess each new thing she encountered with the same measuring attention that had identified Eleanor across a ballroom in December of 1813. Frances crawled the length of the estate office at 8 months and pulled herself upright on the corner of Eleanor's desk and looked up at the stacked ledgers with an expression of frank professional interest. Eleanor had by then expanded her estate management practice in ways that had not been anticipated and were not diminished. The revised tenancy clause structure she had introduced at Ashmore Park was requested by 3 neighboring estates within 2 years, and she wrote a formal reference document that was adopted as standard by the County Estate Association, a document that had no author listed on its cover, because she had found that documents without names attached traveled more easily, and she was interested in the travel, not the credit. The annotated accounts from Ashmore Park's 1819 restructuring were used as a teaching text by Mr. Haverstock in his retired advisory capacity to young men entering estate management, and he always attributed them correctly when he did so, and Eleanor always appreciated this without making a point of it. James found her on a Thursday evening in the spring of their 3rd year of marriage, in the estate office, at the desk she had used since April of 1817, with the lamp at the angle she preferred, and Frances asleep in the small crib that had migrated from the nursery to the corner of the office, because Frances slept better in rooms where things were happening, and Eleanor worked better with her daughter nearby. The door was open. He stood in the doorway as he always had, not knocking, but pausing, which was his version of it, and she looked up. "The drainage is finished," he said. "They laid the last section today." "I know," she said. "I was there for an hour this afternoon." He looked at her for a moment with the particular expression she had come to know entirely, the one that had nothing managed in it, that was simply him, looking at her with the quality of attention that had first distinguished him from everyone else in a crowded room. She knew he was looking. She had known for 3 years the exact quality of when he looked at her that way, as though he was reading something he wanted to read again, and found it correct each time. She returned to the accounts. Frances made a small sound in the crib and resettled. He came in, as she had known he would, and sat in the chair that had been placed at the corner of the desk for this purpose. Not recently, but at some point in the past 2 years that neither of them had explicitly decided, and both of them had arranged. And he picked up the estate plan she had left on the chair's armrest, which he always did, and looked at it in the companionable way of a man reading something in good company. Outside, the Wiltshire spring was settling into the south lawn. The drainage ran correctly, the accounts balanced, the lamp burned at the right angle. Eleanor Ashmore technically, though she still signed the accounts in her own hand and had never found reason to change the signature, turned a page and continued.